In March 2023, Saudi Arabia sat down at a table in Beijing. Not Washington, not New York, not London, Beijing. And what was discussed at that table and what was agreed at that table represents the single most consequential shift in the architecture of global finance since Richard Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. The mainstream financial press covered it briefly, framed it as a diplomatic curiosity, and moved on within a news cycle. I want to explain to you today why that was one of the most catastrophic failures of financial journalism in recent memory, and why what happened in that room in Beijing is the most important thing you can understand about where gold is going and why the dollar's dominance is facing a challenge it has never faced before in its history as the world's reserve currency. My name is Marcus Vail. Over a decade on Wall Street taught me one thing above everything else. The stories that move markets are almost never the ones being covered when they are developing. They are the ones that get dismissed as peripheral until the day they are impossible to ignore. By that day, the people who understood them early have already made their move. I am here today because the China story, the full China story, not the trade war headline version, is exactly that kind of story. And the data says the window for understanding it before it becomes impossible to ignore is narrowing. Let me take you back to 1973 because you cannot understand what China is doing today without understanding what America built 50 years ago. Following the OPEC oil embargo and the monetary chaos that followed the end of Bretton Woods, the Nixon and Ford administrations negotiated a series of agreements with Saudi Arabia that created what became known as the petrodollar system. The arrangement was elegant in its simplicity. Saudi Arabia and the broader OPEC coalition would price oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection and security guarantees to the Gulf states. The consequence of that arrangement, played out across the following 5 decades, was that every nation on Earth that needed to buy oil, which meant every nation on Earth, full stop, needed to hold US dollars. That universal dollar demand is what allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits without a currency crisis. It is what allowed Washington to borrow at low rates despite its fiscal trajectory. It is what gave the Federal Reserve the ability to expand the money supply with consequences that were exported globally rather than felt immediately at home. The petrodollar system is not a minor technical feature of international finance. It is the structural foundation upon which American economic dominance has rested for half a century. What happened in Beijing in March 2023 was the first serious, publicly documented crack in that foundation. Saudi Arabia, for the first time in 50 years of the petrodollar arrangement, sat down with Chinese officials to discuss settling oil transactions in yuan, not as a theoretical exercise, not as a diplomatic gesture, as a practical operational discussion about redirecting real oil flows through a non-dollar settlement mechanism. China is the world's largest importer of oil. Saudi Arabia is among the world's largest exporters. When those two parties discuss settling their transactions outside the dollar system, they are not experimenting at the margins. They are discussing the plumbing of a relationship that runs through the heart of global energy markets. And Saudi Arabia is not alone. Russia has been settling energy transactions with China in yuan and rubles since Western sanctions made dollar settlement impossible. Iran, which has operated under U.S. sanctions for decades, has built extensive bilateral trade relationships that bypass the dollar entirely. The United Arab Emirates has been in active discussions about non-dollar settlement mechanisms for commodity transactions. Iraq, which holds some of the world's largest proven oil reserves, authorized yuan-based settlements for Chinese oil purchases in 2023. The pattern, when you look at it in aggregate rather than as isolated news items, is not random. It is systematic. It is deliberate. and it is being coordinated through the institutional architecture of the expanded BRICS coalition in a way that suggests strategic intent rather than opportunistic deviation from established practice. China's role in this architecture is worth examining precisely because the mainstream coverage of it is so consistently superficial. The narrative in Western financial media treats China's de-dollarization moves as either an irritant or an impossibility, either too small to matter or too ambitious to succeed. The data suggests both framings are wrong. China is the world's largest trading nation by volume. It is the largest importer of virtually every major commodity: oil, copper, iron ore, soybeans, silver, gold. It is the manufacturing center of the global economy in a way that no previous challenger to dollar dominance has ever been. When China prices its commodity imports in yuan rather than dollars, it does not merely reduce dollar demand in those specific transactions. It creates yuan-denominated commodity pricing benchmarks that compete with the dollar-denominated benchmarks that have set global prices since the 1970s. The Shanghai Gold Exchange has been operating a yuan-denominated gold price fix since 2016. The Shanghai Futures Exchange prices oil futures in yuan. These are not symbolic gestures. They are the infrastructure of an alternative pricing system being built in plain sight. The gold dimension of China's strategy is where the data becomes particularly striking. China is simultaneously the world's largest gold producer and the world's largest gold consumer. Its domestic gold mines produce roughly 370 tons annually. Its consumers, investors, and institutions absorb that production and import hundreds of additional tons every year on top of it. The People's Bank of China has been adding to its official gold reserves in nearly every reporting period for the past 3 years, with official holdings now exceeding 2,200 tons by reported figures. But here is what the data also suggests and what official figures do not capture. China has historically made large upward revisions to its officially reported gold holdings after periods of underreporting. Independent analysts tracking import data, refinery flows, and Shanghai Gold Exchange withdrawal figures consistently arrive at estimates of China's true gold holdings that substantially exceed the official number. The gap between what China reports and what the flow data implies is not a rounding error. It suggests a strategic decision to accumulate without telegraphing the full scale of that accumulation to the markets that would reprice if they understood what was happening. Why does China want gold at this scale? The answer is not complicated when you understand the monetary endgame the data points toward. China's long-term strategic objective, stated explicitly in official documents and in the academic literature that informs Chinese monetary policy, is to internationalize the yuan to make it a credible reserve currency that other nations will voluntarily hold as a store of value rather than merely as a transaction currency. The fundamental problem with that ambition is that the yuan is not freely convertible. Capital controls prevent the kind of free international flow that reserve currency status requires. No nation will voluntarily hold its reserves in a currency that can be restricted by administrative decision, unless that currency is backed by something that cannot be restricted, something universally recognized, something that has served as monetary anchor for civilizations across 5,000 years of recorded history. Gold. A yuan with substantial gold backing, or even the credible perception of such backing, changes the reserve currency calculation for dozens of nations that are currently searching for a dollar alternative they can actually trust. This is not a distant scenario being debated in academic papers. The data from central bank reserve composition shifts, from BRICS summit communiques, from bilateral currency agreements signed between China and its trading partners across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, all point toward a deliberate and sustained effort to build the institutional and monetary infrastructure for a post-dollar reserve arrangement. It will not happen overnight. Reserve currency transitions never do. The pound sterling's decline from its peak of global dominance to its current status took decades, but the direction of travel and the deliberateness with which China is moving in that direction is not ambiguous in the data. What is ambiguous, or at least what the mainstream press treats as ambiguous, is what this means for gold. It should not be ambiguous. Every reserve currency transition in history has been accompanied by a major repricing of gold relative to the declining currency. When the pound lost its reserve status after World War II, gold repriced. When the dollar lost its gold backing in 1971, gold repriced from $35 to $850 over the following decade. The repricing is not a side effect of the transition. It is the mechanism through which the transition is completed. Gold is the asset into which purchasing power flows when confidence in the dominant paper currency is being structurally questioned. We are in exactly that environment right now. The confidence is not collapsing overnight. It is eroding systematically at the hands of the world's second-largest economy, operating with a 50-year strategic horizon and the institutional capacity to sustain a decades-long effort. The silver connection to this story runs through the industrial demand channel that the monetary narrative tends to crowd out. China's manufacturing economy consumes silver at a scale that no other nation approaches. Its solar manufacturing industry alone accounts for a disproportionate share of global photovoltaic production and the silver demand that comes with it. Its electric vehicle supply chain, its semiconductor fabrication facilities, its military electronics programs, all of them run on silver in quantities that are not substitutable at current technological development. As China continues to build the industrial infrastructure of a 21st century economy, its structural demand for silver continues to grow regardless of what is happening in financial markets. That industrial floor sits underneath the monetary demand that is being created by the same forces driving the dollar discussion. The combination makes silver's supply-demand picture more constrained than almost any other commodity in the current environment. The data across all of these threads is pointing in the same direction. China is dismantling the petrodollar architecture one bilateral agreement at a time. It is building yuan-denominated commodity pricing infrastructure that competes with dollar benchmarks. It is accumulating gold at a scale that the official figures likely understate. The nations that trade with China, which is to say most of the world by volume, are following its lead in reducing dollar dependence in their reserve management and trade settlement. And the asset that has historically absorbed the purchasing power fleeing a declining reserve currency is gold, with silver following in its wake with the amplified move that the smaller, more constrained market consistently produces. Nothing I have said today is financial advice. Your situation is specific to you and deserves guidance from professionals who know your circumstances. What I can offer is the analytical lens. The petrodollar system was built in a specific historical moment to serve specific strategic interests. Those interests have shifted. The nations that were content to hold dollar reserves and price their exports in dollars have watched that system weaponized against a G20 nation in 2022 and drawn their own conclusions. China is providing the infrastructure for the alternative they are looking for. Gold and silver are the monetary anchors of that alternative, and the repricing that happens when a reserve currency transition moves from the institutional infrastructure phase to the market recognition phase has historically been one of the most significant wealth transfer events in monetary history. I'm Marcus Vail. The meeting in Beijing in March 2023 was not a footnote, it was a signal. The question is whether you heard it when it was still early enough to matter.